Welcome to the Seriously Social podcast with your host, Simone Douglas. Our guest this episode is researcher Ruth Sims from UniSA. She chats with Simone about her research into the phenomenon of followership, about how to empower your colleagues, and about the relationship between leaders and followers.
So today on the Seriously Social podcast, I'm joined by Ruth Sims, who's currently completing a PhD at UniSA and associated with the Centre for Workplace Excellence. And I am super excited to have Ruth here because she's going to talk to us about a concept that I had never heard of before I had a conversation with her a couple of months ago, and that is followership. So can you just give us the Cliff Notes version of what that is?
Well, we think we know a lot about leaders and leadership. Mm-hmm. We assume, and I always start in the leader place because people are comfortable there. Yeah. And followership, people kind of go, you what? Can you say that again? So we've got an idea that we know what leaders do in organisations, but we know very little about what followers do and what good followership is. We assume that people kind of know how to follow. Yeah. We assume that might be the same as being a good employee, and it's not. It's more than that. It's about what does followership bring to the relationship with leaders and leadership, and if someone's leading, what does following look like, and how do you make that really good so that what's happening in an organisation is the best possible work that it can be and the best possible relationship, and it's a lot more fluid. We think of leaders still very often. We've got a kind of old-fashioned notion that leaders are very special people. They do very special things to other people.
I think that's the distinction. Yeah.
Hopefully we're moving more to with other people. But what fascinates me about followership is, what are those people doing and what do they think they're doing when they're following? So it's not imposing a view on people engaged in followership. It's finding out what that is for the people who are doing it. And it's then very fluid. So leading and following is not connected necessarily to a role, to a position in a hierarchy. It's about different sorts of behaviours that relate to each other and together do good things in the workplace.
Yeah, cool. So when you say different sorts of behaviours, what kinds of behaviours would you identify as one or the other? And that's a broad question.
Yeah, and the really interesting thing is that often when we start seeing people in a leadership relationship doing good followership, we go, oh, they're proactive. They're thinking for themselves. They're showing leadership. You immediately, we jump there.
We relabel
and
it. And
I'm kind of going, no, let's just hold on to followership for a while, because what I think I'm finding through the interviews that I've done and what I'm hoping to test in terms of a survey shortly is that followership seems to have a couple of dimensions to it. There are two key bits. One of those is about deference. So it's about stepping back and allowing the leader to lead.
Yeah, cool.
And the other bit of that is about support. And so that's about stepping up and helping the leader do what they're doing. And then those two things don't have to be connected to a role.
Yeah.
And in fact, in a lot of really healthy relationships, they'll move.
They're interchangeable.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
But followership is not just leadership, find and replace. It is doing something that supports that relationship and that dynamic. And it can tip over into leadership. And leaders may step back. And you'll have seen in meetings, even quite formal meetings, somebody chairs the meeting and others in the room allow that person to do that.
Yeah.
It's not that they couldn't do it. Some of them might do it better, but they allow that to happen in order for the work to be done. And I think it's those kind of activities that are really interesting.
Yeah, so as a business owner and someone that manages people a lot and engages with people a lot, I think for me, one of the things that I find fascinating about the concept of followership is that I tend to cultivate that quite naturally these days. If I go back to my 20s, I would have been awful at it. I was very good at being a directive leader that says, you will do this, why haven't you done this, what's happening? Whereas these days, you know, I've taken on board probably reading too many business books and God knows what else, but, you know, I like to hear what all of the team has to say, and I'm very aware if I haven't heard somebody's voice, because you know what you were saying before in terms of people stepping up and supporting the outcomes for the organisation or otherwise, you know, it's often about making sure that every voice is heard to build that cohesion, so that then they're all happy to follow me because they've all spoken their piece, or they're all but you know, what are some of the challenges perhaps to the more egocentric leader, if they're looking to cultivate healthy followership, or you know, one that is good for the organisation?
I think that being prepared to listen to other voices is really important. And the folk that I interviewed, one of the questions I asked was, have you always thought about followership the same way, or was there a turning point for you? And quite often people could point to a turning point, and very often it was when they were in their first formal leadership role, and all of a sudden they had to think differently about how that would work, and what they had to do well as a leader, but also what they had to do well as a follower. So it is about, when you're in a leadership role, allowing that space, and being curious, I think, and really wanting to know. From a followership perspective, it's really active. So it's not about even necessarily waiting to be asked, although some people will need to wait, need to be asked. But it is about actually being quite active in that relationship and that role, and providing that either when it's required or when it's asked for. So there's the notion of courageous followership, which has been around for a long time. But it's, and Ira Chaloff is the person who really named this and popularised it. And it's that notion that being a follower is about being very active, and sometimes about saying and doing things that in that moment the leader doesn't necessarily want. And I think being a good leader is about allowing space for that, because it's not about leader and follower as much as it's about leadership and followership.
No, that totally makes sense to me. And I think you know, sometimes in our office we jokingly call those moments career limiting moves, but it's because we know that they're not really. And I think the challenge for a leader, particularly an egocentric one that's maybe still developing some EQ and learning how to be exceptional, is about understanding that your voice doesn't have to be the loudest. In fact, you will be more successful if it's not. Because I think then you create that space for the rest of your team, and then from their perspective they feel empowered then to use their brains, and like you were saying, so step up in their own ways and do their own things, contributing to where we're all going. And there's this really magical thing that I find happens in teams in all of my businesses, usually at about the 3-year mark. I don't know why. So I'll start a business, and I suppose because the first 12 months is ridiculously painful when you kind of flat out, and the second 12 months you kind of find your feet and going, what am I doing wrong, what can I do better? But the 3-year mark, I tend to get to this place where I literally just open up the doors and I'm like, now I need to know from all of you guys, how do we go where we're going, how do we get there, what haven't I thought about, what, you know, all of these kinds of things. And I had a really fun day with the team at the Duke of Brunswick on Monday, because I asked them to do 2 exercises. So I said, you know, let's start with the positives. I want you to write down the 4 attributes that you think every member of the team has to have. Okay, so you have to be able to exhibit all 4 of these in order to work here. And so that, you know, they came up with like 20 words, and we eventually got down to 4. And that was all very nice and, you know, fairly common exercise. And I said, write down the 4 words that you think if somebody applying for a job here exhibits even one of them, I'm not going to be allowed to hire them. So write down the 4 things, whatever those 4 things are. And, you know, they got to things like, you know, negative attitude, lazy, you know, excuse culture, all of these kinds of things. So I had the 4 words. And then I said to them, okay, in the last week, of you doing your job. In the last week, of the pub, I want you to think about those 4 negative words. I want you to personally give yourself a score based on how many times you exhibited one of those characteristics that you've said, I can't hire somebody if they exhibit even one. And everyone went very quiet. But I said to myself, I can't measure that. I can't hold you to account on that. The only person that can do that is you. But yeah, it was a fascinating way of kind of flipping it on the head, because I've seen the change since then as well. So one of the things that I found fascinating about that process is when you see the aha moment drop for all of them, and then they know what they're doing then.
Yes.
I have to get out of their way at that point, because...
Yeah. And I think that common purpose is really important. So, that classic definition of leadership, it's influencing others to achieve a common purpose. Well, it is. And the common purpose is absolutely vital in an organisation. But it's also that being able to relax enough so you're not the hero leader.
Yeah.
And I think for a lot of people who take on leadership roles, their real aha moment is when they go, I don't have to know all the answers all the time about everything.
Yeah.
And that's a real relief.
Yeah.
Because nobody can.
No.
It is far too complicated for one person to be in that role constantly. And so what you're describing with your team is a leader who's able to relax enough to allow others to show leadership. Yeah. And for a group of people who are often in followership roles able to pick up leadership, which means you're flipping into a followership state at times.
Yeah.
And I think if we move away from that, the heroic notion of leadership, we get a lot closer to leadership which incorporates followership, and it is about relationships in order to do whatever it is that the organisation is intended for.
Absolutely. And I think it's one of those things too that I could be wrong because I haven't been to uni for a very long time, but we don't have enough robust conversations about these things in business school, I don't think, unless something's changed in the last 10 years. But
my mission is to bring followership in.
Yeah, I think that's really important, because when we were having the conversation a couple of months ago and you said, I'm researching followership, I'm like, what's that? Because again, it's that, for me, it was almost evangelical in terms of, the concept of, yes, you can't have a leader if you don't have followers, and vice versa. And a healthy workplace culture will mean that they are fluid and interchangeable, and many people will step into either role or both and. So how do you think the followers can support cultivating a leader that allows those things to take place?
I think sometimes as followers we can be really tough on leaders. And I think often when we do that as followers, we forget that actually as followers we hold the power. So we often, and in business school, we're taught that, the leader is terribly important and has access to all these resources and is able to, distribute them, and that makes a leader powerful. Well, there is some real truth in that, but a leader doesn't lead without followers, and followers choose to follow. So I think often followers can be really hard on leaders, expect too much of them, expect them to be heroic when followers are not prepared to be active participants. It's much easier to complain about what's happening over there. If you take followership seriously, you're in there and you're committed and you're doing, and it's very active and it's very powerful, which is a challenge to those more egocentric leaders. But in terms of where you see organisations and teams in organisations working well, that tends to be what you see. I think followers do need... being supportive is not being a doormat.
Yeah. No, absolutely. And that's a great concept too, I think, because in our society we're often told, nice guys finish last, and that whole doormat concept. And it's like, you can't be a nice human being and look after your own needs at the same time. There's all these kind of like different societal undertones that happen. But it's been my experience that, working within a team environment, whether it's as the leader or as a follower, just remember that all of the people were human beings. And so, yes, I might have been a bit short with you today, but that's because I didn't sleep last night because I had to stand down 10 of my staff thanks to COVID or whatever it might be. Or, I know that I have a tough conversation because I have to ask my team to take a pay cut for like the foreseeable future. So business owners and leaders, they have all of these different pressures. But we don't share them and we don't talk about them enough, I think, which doesn't empower our followers to actually support us because they don't understand.
No.
So I think that there's a huge opportunity when you're prepared to, as a leader, be seen and be vulnerable and be honest, then that opens the gateway for your followers to really step up and actively participate and support you because they know what's going on. Yeah. So, yeah.
And it may then be that the followers you don't want in your team are the folk who go, just tell me what to do. They may be perfect in another environment, but they may not be the followers that you need in this environment now. So I think leaders and followers do choose each other to a certain extent. There are organisations that are much more hierarchical. They're not going to have the sort of leadership and followership that you're describing. So there's probably a little bit of self-selection happens there as well.
Absolutely. So if we wanted to read more about what you have to say about followership or keep track of your research as it's getting released, where would we go find all those things?
At the moment, I don't have anything published, but I'm active on LinkedIn.
Yeah, cool.
So I tend to publish blog posts, small opinion pieces on there, and I'll certainly make the academic work available through that as well. That's probably a good place to be finding me at the moment.
Oh, fantastic. Well, Ruth, thanks very much for joining me on the Red Chairs.
Thank you.
Thoroughly enjoyed our chat, and we'll make sure that we share your LinkedIn profile link when we release the podcast.
Thank you so much. It's been good.
Thank you for listening to the Seriously Social podcast. See our website for more details at www.socialmedia.aok.com.au/podcast. Check the show notes for credits, music used in the program, and more details about our guests.